transnational corporation loses money, does that weaken Israel's grip on the occupied territories? Yes or no? Is it supposed to have an impact on us, or is it supposed to have an impact on them? That is what we have to think about with these interventions. And I think it's telling that, as far as I can tell from investigating the BDS movement, there is no agreement even on the final political goal. There is no agreement, for example, on whether they want a one-state solution or a two-state solution. So if there's no agreement on goal, it of course follows that you cannot have any agreement on strategy, because you actually don't know where you're going. Of course, they want to uphold Palestinian rights, and that's important. But that is not a political goal. And so where is the political strategy that will lead you down that road? Now, comparison is often made explicitly to South Africa. My analysis of the South African case would suggest that the contribution of sanctions to the termination of apartheid was actually relatively modest. But the clear difference from the situation in Palestine today is that the call for sanctions was made by a very well-organised, substantial and clever political movement that had a very coherent understanding of what underpinned the apartheid state, what forces underpinned it, what was the power block, how did it manage to sustain the domination of 90% of the population who weren't white. And it understood also that sanctions were only ever meant to supplement the overall political strategy for dismantling that regime. Okay? It was only meant as an external assistance in a small and modest way to an internally directed process of self-determination, which involved mass mobilisation and the creation of broad cross-cutting alliances across South African society. And it was only, sanctions were only effective in combination with this mass mobilisation, which threatened the white regime with revolution. And those conditions today are obviously absent in Palestine. Now, I'm not saying that there cannot be a credible strategy for ending the occupation, or that sanctions cannot, ipso facto, they cannot contribute to that strategy. What I'm saying at the moment is I don't see what that strategy is meant to be. I don't see how BDS can contribute to that. And I think it's telling that BDS seems to be used, as sanctions are more broadly, as a substitute for that kind of political mobilisation and for that broad mobilisation of society and its strategy. So we've heard also on the panel tonight that the BDS comes along after the death of other things, the decline and the termination essentially of the PLO, the decline of Fatah into a group of self-serving elites, the conversion of the Palestinian Authority into a gendarme of the Israeli state, and then subsequently the confinement and slow strangulation of Hamas. So we're talking about BDS coming along after the death of the political mobilisation of the Palestinian people for their own liberation. So I don't think we can measure the success of the BDS campaign in terms of how many campuses sign up to BDS, how many unions sign up to BDS, how much money is lost by transnational corporations. What we need to ask for is it opening up political dynamics on the ground in Israel-Palestine that can lead to a resolution of this conflict? What are those dynamics meant to be? That is how we should be measuring BDS. Is it altering the balance of forces on the ground? I'll leave that to people who know a lot more about Israel to answer. But those are the questions I think we need to be asking about the campaign. Thanks.
Wow, thank you everyone very much. I'm now going to start the discussion with a few questions, but I also invite each of you to comment to each other. It's obvious that all of you resonate with each other, kind of having counterbalances, and I'm sure each of you have prepared lots of comments. I would like to start by just asking, kind of turning back to Dr. Lee, but I'm gonna say all my questions I think at the same time and then invite you all to speak. Dr. Lee Jones, I do want to counter back to what Professor Pappe said, with that the boycott in a way seems, or at least from my understanding of part of what he said, that the boycott is in a way about us. That you're right that maybe that there needs to be a direct strategy on BDS, but that maybe we should think about that element of the effectiveness, and specifically your comment about is it about them or about us. That I think it's both in that sense. That it is about where they need us to go, but also about what we should be doing to support them, and that's what they've asked. I have a question for Dimi and also for Hannah that I think is very similar, so I'm going to kind of combine it together. That, as Ilan put it, and as the BDS movement has often stated, and that the Israeli public that engagement with the Israeli public through dialogue and consciousness and so on, conscious raising and politicization and so on, has been tried and has failed. And that external pressure is the only strategy left. And this seems to be a really valid point, since the Israeli public typically disengages politically when it comes to the conflict and the suffering of Palestinians, and the refugees inside Israel and in the occupied territories. And in light of this, can you explain why the politicization of the Israeli public should be a consideration of the BDS campaign? I think both of you should think about that. And also, Hannah, I often can't help but think that, specifically since Yachad's main purpose seems to be to engage with the Jewish mainstream, that activism shouldn't necessarily be limited to consensus. That the activist community should lead the discourse as opposed to being guided by the mainstream. That otherwise, how do we change anything? How do we engage? How do we get them moving? Because waiting for the inside movement will never happen if we don't bring them with us. Dr. Chalcraft and Professor Pappe, I had a question that none of you touched on that I'm really curious about regarding the movement, and that is, it seems to be aimed exclusively at Israel, and it seems to ignore a larger global context, and especially the role of the United States. And I'm not sure that either of you are specific experts to speak about this, but how can BDS be developed to address that, the external partner, specifically in terms of if we want to think about strategy. And then I also wanted to ask Dr. Chalcraft that, because you brought up the issue of different kinds of economic boycotts, and I know that you're involved in the boycott against the academic boycott, that how do we, and I know that this is a criticism of BDS, how do we engage in an effective boycott of Israeli products, in particular the Israeli academia, when so much of the technological and medical industries are based on Israeli innovations? How does BDS deal with this very large criticism, and how can they maybe better deal with this problem in order to build effective boycotts? And I can't help to ask, finally, Ilan, the comment that Hannah made, that Dimi made, that many people made about the intractability of the Israeli public, the siege mentality of the Israeli public, and that it is necessary to build some kind of majority movement from the inside, and if BDS is thinking strategically, then it needs to engage with them somehow, and just increasing that sense of siege mentality and intractability seems not to be an effective way to build a movement, and that maybe, and so how can BDS and those who are working with BDS develop a better way of dealing with this? And now, I also invite you again, not just to respond to me, or ignore me if you like, and talk to each other, because that's what we're here for.
In the same order, if you want.
Oh, sorry, I think we should start at the other end to give kind of a fair roundup.
Okay, thanks, Shari, for those excellent questions. So the question is really, who's the target? And the question is also about means versus ends. So early boycott campaigns by the ANC were not aimed directly at producing effects on the ground in South Africa. They were aimed at shifting the consciousness of British people in particular, because the anti-apartheid movement was founded in London, so that the policy of the United Kingdom towards South Africa would change. But that was based on an analysis of what was sustaining the apartheid regime. So there was a notion in the ANC's political analysis of the regime that there were a number of external props. So apartheid was not self-propelled or self-contained, but actually was sustained by a number of different flows or channels of support. Political support, economic interaction, military transfers, etc., etc. And so the goal was to shift the consciousness of the British people so that the London government wouldn't be able to do those things for the apartheid regime, which would then change things on the ground. Okay, so what's the distinction there? We are not the end. We are the means to some other end. Okay, so yes, a boycott campaign can think about the external things that keep a state or a regime going and try and move those away. And so the campaign can in fact be directed elsewhere. It can try and produce effects outside of the target state. But ultimately you're still trying to produce a change in the relation of forces in that target state. So I don't think it's appropriate to think about us as the end, as giving us something to do or a way to feel good about ourselves. Is that the best use of our energies? Maybe, maybe not. We can have an argument about that. But there might be actually more politically productive things that we could be doing if actually BDS turns out not to have the effects on the ground. So that's why I think we need to evaluate it really strategically rather than in terms of moral exaltation.
Thank you. Anything else? I'll take the question about politicizing Israelis and how it failed. I think it's I think that the whole situation right now generally is in a deadlock. You can't bully or guilt Israelis into opposing the occupation. You can't right now persuade them to oppose the occupation, partly because the intensity of the conflict has lowered, and Israelis right now find that they can go on with the current status quo for a while. So it's this transitional period that I think will end when the emphasis of our political activity shifts, and by that I mean that the deadlock signifies the death of the old peace process, of the attempt to partition Israel-Palestine into two distinct states. I think it's both the solution and the peace process and rhetoric that have been employed to achieve it have been completely discredited, both by political violence and by from either side, and simply because they've been trying it for 20 years, in most cases not very energetically, but it's been always kind of a hum in the background that we're trying to make peace and divide into states, and it's not happening. People are losing faith in that. So neither BDS nor, I fear, Yachad and J Street activities will necessarily persuade Israelis to go for it. So I think that we need to, as painful as it may sound, I think we need to look in the longer term and see how we can hook up with different trends and movements developing on the ground. Right now, there aren't many ways to progress on the two-state front because the road is blocked. It's not there anymore. So in other words, persuading Israelis hasn't worked. That doesn't mean that BDS will work. BDS also won't work. We'll need to look for a third way.
I'm going to sort of answer your question and just make a couple of comments, which is that I actually think that if the debate about BDS is about us, then we're hugely misguiding our collective energies. That actually, if you care about ending the occupation, this is not about what can I do sitting in London, what can I not buy, what impact can I not make. Actually, you've got to be more strategic about how you use your power, and everybody does have power. And I have to say that I take a slight issue with this notion of that's what they have asked. Who is the they? Palestinian society is not homogenous. People take issue when people talk about what Israelis want, and this notion that they have, the call has come from them to us, therefore we must obey, is a slightly, in my opinion, patronising way of looking at a population. I totally agree that actually that you have to lead from the front, that you have to the activist community should push the boundaries and should try and bring people with. I think when you don't bring anyone with you, you totally fail. And I think you have to be strategic about how you build alliances, about how you get people on board. And I know this debate is not about the morality of the boycott, but I just have to say that if you want to be effective, a movement which does not acknowledge any culpability on the part of the Palestinians is not going to bring the Israeli public with you. And I'm afraid that if you want to end the occupation, you have got to bring the Israeli public with you.